Hello and welcome to Separate Bathrooms. My name's Daddo. This is my wife.
Daddo.
And we're coming to you from our home studio. Today we wanted to revisit one of our favourite episodes with one of our favourite teachers, Dr. Alexandra Solomon. We spoke to her last year and it just seems that what we talked about is so relevant today.
We hear COVID 24/7. It's the topic of a conversation of everyone's lips right now. Is COVID this, COVID that, all over the news. I'm tired of hearing about it, quite frankly. We're just, getting on with things. Though COVID does affect our relationships, or it, maybe for positive, maybe for negative, I don't know. But in this particular podcast, talking with Dr. Alexandra Solomon, I think her advice around sexuality, particularly in reference to her book, Taking Sexy Back, I think it's really worth having another listen to in regards to what's going on with yourself and what's going on with your partner. And maybe there's more information to listen to with a different ear now that we've been spending so much time at home with our partner.
Like arguing over whose phone charger cord it is.
We would never do that. Sexual self-awareness, she talks about, and that's a really important part of the individual self, let alone in partnership, but the individual self. To learn more about that for yourself is really important. And I love the way she talks about finding the sexy within, not from the perspective of someone else's gaze upon you. I think that is just genius.
Well, let's have a listen to Dr. Alexandra Solomon. Hope you love it. Welcome, Dr. Solomon.
So nice to be with you.
I can't tell you how many times I quote you, how many pages I've dog-marked, how many times I've highlighted things from your book. I had bought your book, Taking Sexy Back, probably about 6 weeks ago, and I'd been following you on Instagram for a while. So I'm blown away by this book, actually. I find it so creative. I find it so kind. I find it so inclusive. How did you come about writing this book?
Oh, gosh. This book holds such a special place in my heart. And it was such a different journey than the first book, much like somebody who's gone through 2 pregnancies or more. It was a very different gestation and conception. The whole thing was just so different. So I had written my first book, Loving Bravely, and even as I wrote that book, in the back of my mind, I thought, boy, I have a lot more to say about the topic of sex. But there's only so much you can do in any one given book. So I sort of knew that somewhere in the back of my mind was a desire to dive in a bit more to how this whole idea of relational self-awareness travels with us into the bedroom. And so that's really where Taking Sexy Back was born, was from a desire to unpack and develop a process for helping people come to know their erotic self more deeply. And so that's what sexual self-awareness is journeying to our own interior to understand what we've inherited around sex, the messages, and how much those get in the way. And I started working on it right as the Me Too movement began, and we started to have finally these larger conversations about sexual violence and the painful intersection of gender and power and sex. And I wanted to add my voice as a way of also making sure that we talk not just about reducing pain, but also about increasing pleasure.
The word sexy has a lot of different connotations. I have my definitions for it. Ali probably has hers. And I'm just curious about what your definition of sexy is in connection to the book.
Right. What I did in the book was sexy is, as you said, it's this adjective that people define differently and that people also have different relationships with. And I think especially for those who've been socialized in the feminine, for women, sexy is something we sort of carry as a question. It's not for us to decide. It's how we are experienced in the gaze of another, right? And that just sort of parallels this whole relationship oftentimes that women have with their sexuality, which is it's a duty or it's a performance versus it's something that whose origin is inside of me. And so in the book, we take sexy from an adjective into a noun. And so your sexy then is your sexual self, your erotic self. And so we're getting to know our sexy in this book. And it is, it's a way of sort of shifting the focus from out there to in here. Because of course, we can't have wonderful sex if all we're doing is focusing on the out there part, either how I look or how you're experiencing me or how you're doing. If we're so focused on the other, we really lose our own ability to feel pleasure, to feel aliveness, to feel connection.
So then sexy is your own definition of your own feeling, as opposed to what you're saying is there's this outside thing of a validation.
Yes, right. So sexy is my own, it's all of the ways in which I relate to sex as a gateway to myself, to my healing, to connection, right? So sexy is not something I wonder how you experience me. It's about how I experience myself.
And that's so different for women. You know, I grew up in the modeling industry, and it's always been about how I look, you know, what's sexy, how I'm going to purvey something that's sexy in a garment. And so to flip that narrative is really exciting, and it seems really foreign, and yet it shouldn't be foreign.
Well, yeah, it speaks to how much we are, and I think that men have their own, you know, I think writing this book took me so deeply into compassion for men's complicated relationship with their own sexual selves. And but for right now, we're talking about, right, that experience of what it is to grow up as a girl is to be forever aware of how you're being experienced and walking this very narrow line between too much, too little, right? The sort of slut shaming, virgin shaming, and it's sort of everybody else's opinion about how, you know, I think it's a artifact of patriarchy or a reflection of patriarchy that we have so much permission to judge and talk about how any given woman is presenting herself in any given moment. It's part of the nature of the structure we've been living in for generations and generations.
And of course, that, as you said, that is going to affect intimate relationships with your partner. And everyone, when they talk about sex, you know, there's always this idea of, let's bring it down to numbers. Okay, if I'm having sex 3 times a week, then therefore I've got a healthy relationship. But if I've only had it once every 6 months, you know, we're in trouble. You know, we tend to just put numbers on how many times couples have sex. I know it's a very big question, but what would you say is a healthy sex life for couples?
It's a beautiful question. I think you're exactly right to start with this piece that's about, so far, the only way we've ever defined a healthy sex life is frequency, which is in some ways the least interesting question to ask about it, but it is in some ways it's the easiest question to ask. It's the most quantifiable question, right? To me, it's a parallel to how many pounds I weigh on the scale, right? Like that's an easy way to say, like, how do I look, or am I okay? Is my relationship to a number on the scale. So it's like kind of quantifying as a way of like reducing my anxiety about my okayness. So I think that's what happens for couples is like, we like look for this sort of silver bullet, magic bullet around like, if we're having sex this many times, then we're okay. Versus a more complicated question of like, what are we seeking when we make love with each other? And what is the quality? And how do we feel before, during, and after? And what is the function of sex in our relationship? How do we use it? And how is your journey through any given experience different from my journey? Like those are wildly interesting questions that are certainly harder for a researcher to maybe get into, but I think also maybe more frightening for us. Like we kind of want that quick fix of like, okay, we're doing it, you know, whatever, once a week, once a month, whatever that magic metric we think is. Well, so I think a healthy sex life, to answer Allie's question finally, I think a healthy sex life is whatever the couple defines it to be.
Because that's where that gets, I guess, in trouble, is because if the guy thinks that it's, as you said, once or twice a week or a month or whatever, and the girl's like, no, and then that's when you end up arguing over our frequency.
Well, and that is, so desire, you know, the fancy word for it is desire discrepancy. And that is absolutely the most common sexual problem that couples encounter is desire discrepancy of like, I want it 3 times a week and you want it every 2 weeks. And how do we bridge that gap? And I think there are ways certainly to bridge that gap. And I think it's an unrealistic expectation to expect that both people will want the same kind of sex at the same frequency all of the time. But one of the things I think is helpful is the moment, especially for heterosexual couples. So I think heterosexual couples get into the most trouble with this because the heterosexual sexual script is so very linear. It's penis and vagina penetration. That's the thing that you count as like, check the box, we had sex. But the moment we start to make a more expansive menu, then maybe we actually don't have that big of a desire discrepancy because if we have a number of options on the table, then I can be thoughtful about what I'm available for. And if it's not the same thing you're available for, I bet there's something we both would, could count as a sexual, erotic, connecting experience. So I think just that like widening out of what counts. What are we counting? And if the only thing we count is penis and vagina sex, then yeah, you're going to end up with a pretty big discrepancy because that is in some ways a larger ask for a vulva-bodied person than a penis-bodied person, right? You are to make space to be penetrated it's a different kind of a thing than just whatever, oral sex or a hand job or other kinds of things that maybe would be, if they were items on the menu and they were sort of valuable items on the menu, then maybe we wouldn't end up feeling so very far from each other.
So
it's a buffet rather than just a one course.
Yeah, but in these COVID times, they've taken buffets away.
Right. Well, then all the more reason that we have to make sexual buffets.
We have to make it.
So communication is obviously a massive key to this, where we have to be continually checking in with our partner.
Absolutely. And that is, in some ways it's like such a joke because where were we supposed to learn how to talk about sex, right? Like it's certainly not part of sex education in the US. I don't know how you guys are doing, but that's just, I spend a lot of time with my college students in this class I teach to undergraduates. We talk about talking about sex because it's so important. The research is clear that couples who can talk about sex tend to enjoy sex more than couples who can't find the language or get really defensive or get really shame-loaded. Problems grow when we can't talk about them.
Tell me some of the barriers that couples face in achieving this wonderful sex life that you've come across.
Well, this is really fun to talk about with both a man and a woman because I think that the barriers are so very gendered. And I think that when there's one or more male partner in the couple, one of the big barriers is around the distinction between pleasure and performance for men, right? When we go back to that, especially that heterosexual script, it's so completely erection focused, right? The whole thing hinges on what's happening with the penis every step of the way. Right? Is it hard? Is it hard enough? Is it, is he coming too soon? Is it taking too long? Like it's so focused on that. And I think that focus ends up really, not that I have lived in this lifetime as a man, but I can imagine that it just feels like a lot of pressure and a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress to kind of keep the experience going, to take a leadership role, to keep it going. When in truth, a man's entire body is a massive source of pleasure, both for himself and for his partner. So that to me is the biggest constraint that men bring into the bedroom is just kind of that, the distinction between performance and pleasure.
A lot of guys take their lead from porn. And there's a definite porn script, where a woman starts it with a blowjob or whatever, and then it sort of follows this similar pattern. That's in heterosexual porn. I've not watched anything else, but that seems to be the way it goes. And also with the male porn stars, I don't know how they do it, but they last for, as long as the video goes.
Isn't that editing?
I don't know. Is it? I guess that's what they call the fluffer in. I don't know.
But you know what? I read recently that the fluffer, there used to be fluffing, right? There used to be a fluffer. And now what they do is they will watch porn on their phones to stay hard for longer. Like it's so meta.
So here's a question, and I think we've got a lot of women that are going to relate to this who are my age, 50, because I'm in menopause myself. And in speaking to a lot of women, I've been doing a lot of research about menopause. The hormonal shifts and the body changes that we go through can be incredibly distressing in an intimate relationship. What's your best advice for a menopausal woman, and how do we get our sexy, I'm going to say sexy back, but maybe we never had it. So maybe it's just the same as a 20-year-old is the same as a 55-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, that piece of it is heartbreaking, is if we are going into menopause without a deep grounded sense of entitlement to our sexualities, then it makes a hard thing harder. So I do think that is even more reason then to be doing this reclamation work. Like this reclamation work can happen. Like I love the idea of women reading Taking Sexy Back when they're 18, 19, 20. So they just start out of the gate, not tolerating subpar sex, knowing how pleasure works in their bodies, all that kind of stuff. But the truth is, many of us can go for decades and decades and not center this as an important piece of our health because, for 87 reasons, which are all in the book. But so for a menopausal woman, I think it is, the first thing is, maybe not the first thing, but one important piece is just naming the sorts of grief that accompany menopause, right? Just there's so many ways that we as a culture are so afraid of age. And so we have to let ourselves grieve that so that we can be open also to these hidden gifts that have to do with wisdom, that have to do with no longer giving an F about certain things. But we can't get there till we name the grief and the sort of loss of the bodies that we used to inhabit and all of that. And then around sex, I think one thing that's important is being able to talk to our partners about it, because the more I feel like I can't talk with you about what we both know is happening, the more my shame is going to grow. So I think there's ways in which it's so beautiful when couples can have a bit of humor and levity about oh my God, what, what is going on with both of us? Because likely both people are experiencing, we don't have as much language around men's changes at midlife, but certainly there are changes there as well. And then lots of lubricant, just so much lube. No shame about.
Buy stock and lube.
Right. Just right there. It's available. It's just.
Yeah. Because one thing that really hit me in your book is when you talk about one of the biggest libido killers is the shame and blame. And I think that is very common in the menopausal years and I've certainly felt this myself, where I've felt this level of shame of not feeling like I want to have sex anymore. And then I feel guilty. And then from that place of feeling ashamed and guilty, there's no way my libido's got a chance at raising its head at that point. So that really stood out to me. It's of course I need to address that in order to feel I want to be intimate again with Cam.
So how do you address that?
Well, I think that's the first step, is just knowing. I think so often we don't know what's happening. We don't name it as what's happening. All we know is I'm either pissed off at you because you keep wanting this thing that I don't want to give or do, or I'm pissed off at me because what's wrong with me and I'm broken. And so I think the first part is naming it for sure. Then being able to talk about it in the relational space and sort of grieve it together, that it's hard, that this is harder than it used to be at other times in our life. Just being able to kind of sit together and this is hard for us. Our sex life isn't the way that it used to be. And then I think so, when the female partner is also the lower desire partner, I think one thing that can really help is to kind of just shift the polarity, let her take the lead, because what happens is like the more the sort of his initiation and her refusal or lack of interest, like the more that kind of keeps going, it takes on a life of its own. So I think one thing that can be helpful is for the couple to agree that that he's not going to initiate, and that she's going to take the lead on it. And that can be helpful just in terms of it kind of can take some of the pressure off. Another thing I think is really helpful is that can be helpful, and couples have to play with this, is sort of like my friend Dr. Steven Schneider calls it simmering, which is just making a lot of space in the relationship for touch, dance, holding hands, kissing, things that aren't going necessarily to lead to sex, but there's just a lot of space for touch and closeness that just helps her throughout the day kind of keep that door open, that, oh yes, I am a woman and I am a lover and I am embodied, and that does feel good. Because sometimes what happens when you get stuck in that cycle of pursuer and like gatekeeper is that then every touch he offers feels like, oh God, he wants it, and now I have to figure out whether I want it and how I'm going to handle that. So for the couple to agree, listen, we're going to be doing lots of touch, and it might be a 2-minute makeout, or it might be that we get in the shower together, but we have to do it without the expectations going to lead to something, because it just maybe helps me remember how much I love being near your body. Like, and it sort of is like that simmering, so that then I feel closer to my erotic self, versus my erotic self is somewhere like in a box in the corner, and I have to kind of go and dig it out and unpack it, and kind of like reducing the distance of it.
It relates back to that idea that I was mentioning before about the porn issue with a lot of guys. Their point of entry into their sexual life is by watching porn, especially at today's age. I mean, I had it by watching or looking at magazines, and if one of my friends' dads had a porn stash, you'd kind of watch his VHS tape. But it's this idea that when you're talking about sex is only a vagina and a penis going together. I do want to talk about my entire body being a penis, as you said. I think that kind of thrills me.
Well, that's a visual.
That's right. You are just a walking penis.
But this is something that Ali and I have been working on too. Not me being a walking penis, but being open to touch and being open to also what's been a big help is me backing off. Like, I know that we've been through periods in our marriage, and we've been married for almost 30 years. So every time I come near her, she thinks, oh my God, she's going to want to have sex again, and I don't want to do that. So I've sort of left it in her court now, and that has worked. Take the pressure off.
I think that there are ways that we as women, when we are in this dynamic, which is it's the dynamic in my marriage as well, that we as women can sort of lose sight of the pain that is associated with saying no to our partner. And so can the no be accompanied with, but I would love to lay in your arms, but just so you know, I do love having sex with you. Like, just ways in which we can sort of say, I find you attractive. I am drawn to you. Like, I do love you. I would be interested in connecting with you in this way. So that it is, I think sometimes we as women can lose sight of the fact that for men, oftentimes sex is a gateway to just feeling okay, to just feeling loved. And so if it feels like it's the only way a man can feel loved, and that's kind of a fraught arena, I want to make sure that we're building in other ways for that sense of you are loved, you are valuable, you are attractive, you mean a lot to me, that there's other ways of conveying that message.
That's wonderful. Because I know that there's been times I've had to reassure you that it's not that I'm thinking about other men. I don't want to have sex with other men. It's still only you that I want to have sex with. It's just that my libido's taking a little break right now. And that's reassured you in that way, right?
Yeah.
If I don't feel you're attracted to me, and in what Alexandra is saying, to still know that I find you attractive, that also takes the coldness out of it, of just no sex at all.
The bit that I respond to most is when we talk about it.
Right.
Because when we don't discuss, when we're not open about what's going on, that's when I'm left in this netherworld going, I don't know where you're at. And I jump to projections. I think you must be thinking about other dudes. You must be, you know, all that sort of stuff. My mind goes down all sorts of Alice in Wonderland wormholes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when we discuss it, it's good. We're talking to Dr. Alexandra Solomon, who wrote the book Taking Sexy Back. It's such a pleasure to have you with us, Doctor. Ali? Dr. Ali? I've got two Alis here. We got a question from one of our listeners, and I'm going to read it out. Her husband refuses to have a vasectomy, and it's a point of contention between them because she feels that she's birthed 3 children. The least he can do is get the snip, so she's no longer the one carrying the responsibility. Any thoughts about that?
That's a great question. Yeah, I can imagine that they've gotten into a cycle of, if you loved me, you would just go ahead and do it. And then he says back, if you love me, you wouldn't ask me to do it. And that's oftentimes how those knots go. You get kind of like bound up in, you know, you should change. No, you should change. And so the way I would want them to talk about it is, I would want, if I was sitting with the two of them and I was the couples therapist, I would want to get very close to him and try to understand from his perspective what the concerns are, what the constraints are, like what's getting in the way. I don't know what the story is. And if it's a story about somehow he feels, I don't know, like he would be emasculated, you know, by getting a vasectomy, then I would want to maybe support him doing some work around how his masculinity is so much bigger and deeper and wider than whether or not sperm comes out when he ejaculates or not. If it's a concern about it's going to kill his libido, I want him to get medical input around that. It's like I want her to really have a chance to understand what's getting in his way. And that would be my starting point. But it's certainly, from where I stand, it seems like a wholly reasonable request. I think that maybe him having not lived as a woman in this lifetime, he may really kind of not understand how complicated a woman's relationship with birth control is, and that it is usually a many, many decade journey of figuring out what birth control to use. And they all have side effects, and that it can be, I can imagine at this point in the game, in their journey, she just would love to live in a world where she's not thinking about that. And I would want him to feel really proud of doing something that would free her mind up a bit, you know, that it would be, rather than emasculating, it's so profoundly loving to free her up from that responsibility.
And she'll bring him lots of food when he's sitting with a bag of frozen peas on his groin, watching the football as he recovers.
Absolutely.
It's love.
When I was reading your book, there's an overwhelming feeling for me. It was like sitting with a girlfriend and just talking, a very wise girlfriend, I must say, talking about sex, talking about sexuality, and how you were saying, you know, you're okay. You can change those negative thoughts to have the relationship with your body first and foremost, and from there with your partner. And as I said, I've underlined and dog-eared so many things. You have the beautiful way of being so inclusive of the LGBTQ community. We have our son who's gay, and I'm just appreciate that so much, how that is throughout the book. And just this feeling that you really care about women having their sexy back, don't you?
I do care about it. And I do care about writing in a way that feels like everybody belongs, that there's a space for everybody. And having been heterosexual my whole life, I'm aware of that privilege, and I have so much empathy for what it must be like to feel like your sexuality is somehow wrong right from the get-go. to have to before you've even kissed anybody, right? To feel like somehow you are wrong, that you are left out of the conversation. And I was really aware that if I was going to do a book on sex, I needed to make sure that everybody felt like they had a place in the book. And it's challenging because sex and gender are so entwined. Like it's so, everything about sex has to do with the bodies that we live in and our genitals and gender role socialization. And those things are different. Once people step out of the heterosexual script, there's a kind of expansiveness of possibility, but also clearly like a heavy burden to carry around what it's like to be marginalized.
Yeah. Well, you did it beautifully. So thank you for writing the way that you do. There's pages in there that are actually a workbook. There's quizzes, there's questions that you ask yourself all the way through the book. It's divided into chapters. And they're questions that I've never asked myself. And I think it's a great, Cam and I were talking, I think it's a great book for guys to read. It is about women, but I think, honey, like I'm looking at my husband going, honey.
Yeah, no, this is good. This is good. I do plan on reading it. I've read bits of it. Ali's given it to me. So we just want to thank you for being on our show today. And we've got a ton of other questions. Will you come back?
Absolutely. I would come back. It's fun. You are delightful to talk to, and so exciting to be able to connect from like around the entire globe and have this conversation. So an intimate conversation that spans so many miles.
How was that for you?
That was an awesome chat. I what do they call it? A girl crush? Woman crush? Wow. What a fascinating
lady. We got to
lady.
get her on next.
Yeah.
Give a triad.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for listening. If you've got any more questions or comments about today's podcast, hit us up on Facebook or Instagram.
Yeah, I'm at Cameron Daddo.
I'm at Daddo.
Yeah, that was it was amazing. And I think for guys too, I'm certainly going to read it.
Just slide that book over to your guy's side or your partner's side, and see if they can have a little glance through it. And we just might learn a few things.